Okay, very good. Let me welcome everyone here today to the latest seminar on in the Sakharov series on human rights. And my name is Mark Kramer. Normally I have chaired these seminars, but today another person, another associate of the Davis Center will be chairing it, Nadia Boyadjieva. And I will briefly introduce her, and then she will take care of everything else. I will still be on the connection, but I will no longer play a direct role in the seminar, at least until the question period, maybe. But Nadia is a professor of international law and international relations at the Balkan Studies Institute in Sofia, Bulgaria, and also visiting professor at Sofia University. She is a long-term visiting scholar also at Harvard's Davis Center, and she will take everything from here. So please, Nadia.
So, okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for Professor Kurilla. Dear colleagues and friends, today I have the pleasure to chair nowadays Harvard seminar, Sakharov seminar on human rights at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, titled The Use and Abuse of Soviet History in Putin's Russia. The Soviet Union ended 30 years ago, and a significant segment of the Russian population have no memories of the Soviet era. Nonetheless, events in Soviet history often come up in Russian political discussions and everyday life in Russia. Today, we have two first-rate speakers to discuss now how Soviet history is both used and abused in Russia under Vladimir Putin. Each speaker will offer 20-25 minutes of opening comments, and then I will take questions from the audience. Those who want to ask questions should submit them via the questions section on YouTube or in the chat section on Zoom. Nina Tumarkin, who will speak first, is a professor of history at Wellesley College. She is also director of Wellesley's Russian Area Studies program and an associate of Harvard's Davis Center. Ivan Kurilla is a professor of modern history at European University of St. Petersburg in Russia. He was formerly a professor of history at Volgograd State University. It is my pleasure to invite Professor Nina Tumarkin to offer her introductory remarks. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very glad to see Mark and Nadia and Ivan, and I wish I could see the rest of you, of course. That's not possible until, well, for many of you, the Davis Center has its opening gathering party, perhaps in September of this year. I'd like to introduce our subject of the use and abuse of Soviet history in Putin's Russia with a broad historical overview of the politics of the past in Putin's Russia. I'll start out, very broad, because very broad, temporarily speaking, going as far back in time as is possible. The practice of people in power in some way signaling, recording, drawing upon markers of notable events, such as victory in battle, in order to produce in viewers or in auditors some desirable affect, some other effects, some display, some particular social or political behavior, is far older than human civilization itself. The impulse to commemorate victory in battle or a successful hunt goes back tens of thousands of years, maybe back to about 45,000 years, if we consider the oldest cave art, or simple cairns as the earliest war memorials. Indeed, in all eras, some glorification of idealized historical events to bolster legitimacy and the support of political regimes was a very common practice. Very recently, well, somewhat recently, consider, for example, Napoleon III's building up the already extant cult of Napoleon I to shore up his own legitimacy and popular support. In Russia, a victorious major battle or war was traditionally celebrated by the erection of a church. And the two most famous instances of this are, of course, St. Basil's Cathedral, to celebrate Ivan the Terrible's conquest of the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan in the 1550s, and much later, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which was erected with great delay in 1883 to commemorate the victory over Napoleon in 1812. This was done under Alexander III, who was Putin's favorite autocrat and the one who most resembled him, deftly balancing a rapid growth of tight bureaucratic control, increased Russification, and imperial rule. Vladimir Putin, from the very beginning of his rule, even when he was actually technically prime minister on December 29th, 1999, when he issued his famous Millennium Message speech, he stressed the importance of history of the past and of the past. He blamed in that speech the Soviet past and not Boris Yeltsin's presidency for virtually all Russia's economic woes, which at that time, as many in this audience know, were more than considerable. And he laid out what he called the Russian idea, replacing ideology, which was forbidden by the 1993 Constitution, with Russian historical values, including paternalistic sentiments, he said, that have deep roots in Russian society. Patriotism, pride in the country's history, the greatness of Russia, statism, and I quote from the speech, our state and its institutions and structures have always played an exceptionally important role in the life of the country and its people. For Russians, a strong state is not an anomaly to be gotten rid of. Quite the contrary, it is a source of order and the main driving force of any change. He was legitimizing what was to become one of my favorite Russian words, государственничество, which is the phenomenon of marking the primacy of the state in all things. In 2000, the very next year, just when he was elected, first, of course, he was acting president, then elected president, there was also a symbolic return of Stalin in a limited way, embodying a strong centralized state, embodying the victory in the Great Patriotic War. In advance of the 65th anniversary of the Great Patriotic War in 2000, Putin authorized a bust of Stalin to be erected in Moscow's Museum of the Great Patriotic War. Some 500 silver coins with Stalin's likeness were issued, but a true cult of the Great Patriotic War, which had faded during the Yeltsin years, was revived in 2004, I would say, or even beginning in late 2003. In addition to the upcoming 2005 60th anniversary of the victory, there had been heated memory wars with the Baltic states at the time or in the aftermath of their admission to NATO and the European Union, the Rose Revolution in Ukraine, in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. All of this intensified the Russian leap into World War II-driven memory campaigns. And tied to the USSR's unique and salvational role in defeating fascism was an assertion that the victory had also been a moral victory, which gave and continued to give Russia the right to dictate policy to others. 2005, the 60th anniversary, was commemorated very grandly, and you see a Russification of the victory, a striking Russification of the victory that had been the victory of the Soviet people, now into a victory and a celebration of Russia and the Russian people, with other Soviet republics pushed out. 2005 was the year when, where is it here? The Georgian Ribbon came into view in a very big way. This is a military decoration that actually was first introduced under Catherine the Great in 1769 for valor in battle, and was used was brought back during World War II. And in the early cult of the war, I have here actually a collection of bookmarks that I bought in Moscow in 1985 on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the victory. And you see the ribbon here. But in 2005, this is what I came home with. They were given out to everybody. There were people standing on the streets. I was there giving them out. People would tie them onto the antennas of their cars. The idea that people should demonstrate, display their pride in the victory. Also, CDs with war songs were given out on the street. I still listen to mine in my car sometimes. A palpable pride in the victory with very little attention paid to grieving for the war dead. There used to be on television every night at around 7 p.m. something called a Minute of Silence, which was really 10 minutes with showing the eternal flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier with a rather mournful and solemn voiceover. That was reduced to 5 minutes, also a strange reduction. Of course, under Khrushchev, the number of the war dead had been set at 20 million. Gorbachev changed it, upped it to 27 million. And for some reason in 2005, Putin decided to take it down by 1 million. So it was 26 million. There was a clear attempt to sort of minimize the grief and also to create a kind of siege mentality to justify the strengthening centralization of Russia after the 2004 Beslan terrorist attack, after the color revolutions. The idea is that there's a threat of terrorists and extremists who want to break up Russia. We have to have the same fighting spirit as we did in the Great Patriotic War. And you also see in 2005, the beginning of Putin's overt personal identity with the war and with the victory, very well described in an article by Elizabeth Wood of MIT. That began in earnest in 2005 and of course has never let up. May 9th, 2005 was mostly simply an orgy of self-congratulation on the part of Russia and the Russian government, matched, as I like to say, only by the 1986 commemoration of Harvard University's 350th anniversary. In 2007 and 2008, there were, and beyond, there were attempts to issue a single textbook of Soviet history, or at least of 20th century Russian history, Soviet history. For various reasons, that was not successful. But the big change in these historical politics and memory politics came after the big protests of 2011 and 2012. On the day of the election of Putin for his third term after the 4 years of the Medvedev presidency, there was Putin gave a speech in Manya Square on March 4th on the night of the election. And he said, "Thank you to everyone who said yes to a great Russia." It's clear that he was going to restore a great Russia. And you see a turn towards conservatism, towards Russian nationalism, and the use of history beginning in 2012 was really ratcheted up. Putin Putin, who had been a uniter of the Russian citizenry or of the citizenry of the Russian Federation, now became much more of a divider, leaning on conservative factions, on the Russian Orthodox Church, on historical memory campaigns. And the first one, many people might not remember, actually had nothing to do with Soviet history. President Medvedev in 2011 announced that 2012 would be Год Российской истории, so the year of Russian history, because of its many major anniversaries. It would be the 150th anniversary of the birth of Imperial Russia's Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, someone much touted by Putin, and the centennial of whose 1911 assassination at the hands of terrorists had been solemnly marked in 2011. The big one, of course, the 200th anniversary of the Patriotic War of 1812, as President Medvedev called it. And in fact, the Napoleonic War had indeed borne that appellation. The 400th anniversary of the liberation of Moscow from the Polish invaders in 1612, ending the time of troubles, and I suppose really my favorite, the 1150th anniversary of the birth of Russian statehood in 862, when the Viking chieftain Rurik arrived in Novgorod, and the northernmost city on the famous trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks, which led to the foundation of the Kievan Empire. Added to this was the 70th anniversary of the beginning of the Stalingrad battle, which was odd to mention because 1942 was the most terrible year of the war, particularly in the summer. None of this really struck much popular interest, except a little bit, certainly, of the 1812 anniversary. Museum exhibits were very widespread, bookstore displays, battle reenactments. Battle reenactors were very popular and began in the late Soviet period with people reenacting the War of 1812. It was actually illegal to enact the sacred Great Patriotic War. And in fact, up until this day, the most popular war for battle reenactors is the Napoleonic War. 2012 also saw the naming as Minister of Culture of Vladimir Medinsky, whom I call master of historical lies and historical politics. The revival of the Russian Historical Society, headed by one dreadful Sergei Naryshkin, who said at the founding, and I quote, "The lessons of Russian history teach moral conduct and politics. By reviving the Historical Society, which had existed in the imperial period, we must consolidate the efforts of the state and scholars, different social and professional groups, in order to foster a national historical culture, at the expense, I might add, of professional historical research expertise." There was also the founding the same year of a Russian Military History Society headed by Medinsky himself. 2012 also was the year in which the Georgian Ribbon became required to be worn by salespeople in shops in advance of Victory Day. I saw this myself in April and May of 2012 in Moscow and Volgograd. And at this point, the Georgian Ribbon had its meaning transmogrified from celebrating the victory to being a supporter of Putin, or rather, the two sentiments were merged into one. Celebration of the victory, supporting Putin, sort of no difference. And there was, and I can briefly mention a new initiative for the glorification of Russian greatness, again, from Russia's pre-Soviet past, World War I. Now, World War I had been a complete blank in the Soviet Union and Russia for almost a century. But in 2013, Europe was gearing up for a 2014 commemoration of the centennial of the beginning of the war in France. So in 2013, the Kremlin is fascinating to look at, rushed into production a national memory of World War I, with Russia as a victor nation, if you can believe it. A hurried competition for and construction of a dreadful monument. I shouldn't use these adjectives, of a monument in Victory Park, with consisting of a huge Russian flag and tiny soldiers under it and tiny people. In 2014, the Uroki Mужества in the schools, the lessons of courage campaigns focused that year on the brave soldiers of the Russian Imperial Army. 2014, that was a big year in Russian memory politics. First of all, the Sochi Olympics. Every opening ceremony is an opportunity for a country to display an idealized selective narrative about itself to be viewed worldwide. For example, in 2002, the Athens ceremony celebrated Minoan classical Greece, then sped through Alexander the Great, followed by a brief nod to the 1100-year Byzantine period, and catapulted immediately to its 1812 revolution, leaping over and omitting completely the almost 400 years of Ottoman rule, to present classical Greece as the essence of what Greece was in 2002. The Sochi opening ceremony, interestingly, focused very much at first on culture, especially 19th century Russian culture, with much time devoted to the famous ball in War and Peace. And then in the Soviet period, it left out World War II entirely, presumably as either too sacred or too divisive, and focused on the Stalin era on beyond, with a great deal of time celebrating the industrialization and avant-garde art of 1928-29, the first five-year plan, then pioneers marching, celebrating the pilot heroes of the 1930s, and then the exploration of space. Of course, in 2014, we have the events in Ukraine. In February also, in Maidan, then the annexation of Crimea, the war in the Donbass. And we see from the get-go, Moscow and Kiev hurling great patriotic war-driven insults, fascist scum, Banderites, anti-Semites at each other, although Banderites is was the Russian hurled at Kiev, referring to Stepan Bandera, who had fought together with the Germans in the early part of the war. Of course, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, there was Putin's famous speech of March 18th, which was drenched in distorted history. He spoke about Crimea, speaking of our shared history and pride, that it's the location of Chersones, where Prince Vladimir was baptized in the 10th century. This has not been proved, in fact. And he talked about how this was united the peoples of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, even as he wanted to unite them. Then in 2014, there were peons to Sevastopol, peons to Balaclava and Kerch and Malachov Kurgan. These were all from the Crimean War, as though Russia had not gone down in ignominious defeat in the Crimean War of 1854-1856. Sapun Ridge was mentioned, the final stage of the Crimean Offensive of 1944. 2014 was also the year in which, just before Victory Day, Putin signed into law the criminalization of any public deviation from the official narratives about World War II. Quote, to spread intentionally false information about the Soviet Union's activities during World War II, as well as the, quote, the spreading of information on military and memorial commemorative dates related to Russia's defense that is clearly disrespectful of society, to publicly desecrate symbols of Russia's military glory. This is Wikipedia quoting Ivan Kurilla, which is why I brought it in. This period of the mid-20 teens also saw the Russian Orthodox Church playing an ever greater role in shaping politically useful historical narratives. As Marlene Laruelle of George Washington University called it, it was the Russian Orthodox Church's conquest of the history market. And most striking has been the Россия моя история, Russia My History museums, now in 23 cities, overseen from the beginning and shaped by the Russian Orthodox Church with funding from Gazprom, celebrating a skewed version of Russia's history that glorifies every Romanov ruler, blames the West for all of Russia's catastrophes, including even the 1917 revolution. The Russian Empire, it says, was destroyed by its own elites with the February Revolution, caused by Western liberal values and Western-oriented worldviews as the real evil that destroyed Russia. And then came 2015, the 70th anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. It was meant to be a great event. As it turned out, it was not what they had expected. Because of the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass being followed by the sanctions, the Moscow ceremony was boycotted by all major Western leaders except Serbia, although Angela Merkel did come and lay a wreath in the tomb of the unknown soldier the following day. The whole anniversary celebration was really about Krym nash, Crimea is ours. There was a defiant jubilation celebrating Crimea, anger at the Western imposed sanction and at the Western boycott of the anniversary, all mushed together with the celebration of the victory anniversary. The Soviet Great Patriotic War cult had included a peace-loving component of sort of never again, with the USSR as a guardian of the peace, much like Japan played that role in Hiroshima and has done. Now in 2015, all the need to guarantee peace was gone. I saw bumper stickers and posters saying 1941 to 1945, we can do it again, including violent ones with the US White House in flames, very disturbing. 2015 was also the first time that the Immortal Regiment marched in central Moscow, and Ivan Kurilla will talk about the Immortal Regiment with Putin in the front row every year. Most important, Russia's intensified militarism coincided with the escalation of a cult of the victory that rapidly eclipsed the cult of the Great Patriotic War. In 2017, the Museum of the Great Patriotic War was renamed the Victory Museum. And another new element more recently has been the heroization of everyone who had fought in the war. I mean, whatever happened to the idea that soldiers were thrown into battle because they had been forced to, or had chosen to fight, and that a few standouts had accomplished heroic acts? Now, beginning with utterances by Putin and rapidly moving into the realm of commonly accepted truths, is the assurance that all of the millions of fighters whose portraits are borne aloft in the Immortal Regiment marches were heroes. Also all of the people who were exhumed and reburied by the searchers who look for the many extant MIAs also were heroes. Every dead officer and soldier was a hero because each one had contributed to the victory. Summing up, I see I'm running out of time here. I'd like to just quickly point out that that I think much of this was very successful, judging by polls, by Levada Center polls, in asking about what people think about when they first think about their country. More than 50% in 2018 said our past, our history. 88% named the victory in the Great Patriotic War as the event of which they're most proud. This widespread Russian pride in selected episodes in its history is, of course, an absolute antipode to the United States' current scene, with its recent calls for national shame over ugly chapters of its past. Since 2017, US monumental politics has emphasized the removal or destruction of monuments. In Russia, monuments have been springing up like mushrooms. St. Vladimir was put up in 2016 to rival the one in Kiev built 150 years earlier. Ivan the Terrible in 2016. An alley of rulers in Moscow in 2017 with busts of every ruler beginning with Rurik. Kalashnikov, you know, the Kalashnikov rifleman, there was a monument put up to him in 2017. My conclusion here is that Putin will have his usual past pomp no matter the cost. Of course, 2020 was supposed to have been an unparalleled extravaganza as the last major anniversary at which veterans might be present. And as even as relations with the EU and US were a low point, Putin just hated the idea of putting it off when the virus hit. And also it was to be a celebration of Putin himself, because it was going to be just about 2 weeks after what was going to be the passage of a constitutional reforms referendum planned for April 22nd, 2020. In fact, of course, the referendum was postponed until the summer. Desperate to keep things on schedule despite the raging virus, there were rehearsals for the gargantuan military parade in 2020 in March and in April. No one could know what the toll was in terms of infection. Not until April 16th did Putin announce the postponement of the Victory Day parade to a different date. They weren't clear then what it was. On May 9th, there was a flyover, some local events. The parade took place in full pandemic on June 24th, 2020, far too early to be safe. Again, no one could know the toll in terms of infection. What about Victory Day 2021? Well, even as Italy has issued last week and earlier a lockdown throughout Italy in advance of Easter, so they shouldn't be big crowds, and Pope Francis addressed a small socially distanced congregation instead of speaking to vast crowds of pilgrims. Russia is forging ahead with opening everything up in time for Victory Day. And this morning, April 6th, the Kremlin opened accreditation for journalists covering the event of Victory Day. The Victory Parade, the normally gargantuan Immortal Regiment processions will proceed on May 9th, according to pre-pandemic practice. Predictably, the victory will be attributed to Russia practically single-handed with little reference to the Allies. We used to say that Russia is a country with an unpredictable past. Well, perhaps those days are over and the past of Russia is no longer unpredictable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tumarkin, for this very interesting and thoughtful presentation. And now I'm giving the floor to Professor Kurilla to offer his introductory presentation.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you, Nina, for your so brilliant description of the changes over the Russian historical politics during these decades. I will also start with some brief overview of what went through, what Russia went through these decades, and trying to probably to suggest some explanation, if not to everything which happened with Russian historical politics, but at least to the sum of the big turns we experienced. And by the way, I am tempted to start with this very good comparison of American current situation with the removal of monument, and indeed Russian continued building more and more of the monuments. You know, Russian Society for Military History that Nina mentioned has on its website a special part named Monumental Propaganda, and that's about the erection of more and more monuments, which seems a bit strange, I would say. But I should start with the importance of history for Russia. You know that for Russia, the history of the state and history of Russia serves to a large extent as a social glue. Even now, even in the period long after the period of the creation of the nation states, when usually history was used for such purposes. But for Russians, history continued to be a very important part of their identity building and identity construction. And that is also because of the recent destruction of the communist idea, of the ideology that was informed the Soviet regime, the Soviet time, when the Soviet Union was building the bright future. After the collapse of this idea of bright future, the past became the only source for inspiration, the only source for social glue. And after a decade of Yeltsin decade of the 90s, when the history was, well, to a lesser extent important for the Russian political conversations, it again began, the history began to be revived by the state, by Putin personally and by his advisors, who very soon discovered that history can be used as a source for a new ideology or quasi-ideology, which is actually how Russia turned to become, or Russian history turned to become in these 2 decades. But first, the first idea that came with President Putin was to create some uninterrupted sequence of Russian history. The first idea was to somehow marry the Soviet history with imperial history and with post-Soviet history. So the first idea was to, and it was a time when Putin insisted and State Duma voted for combination of the imperial time coat of arms, I mean, not coat of arms, but the state emblem, and the Soviet hymn, Soviet state song, and Russian, I would say, Republican 3-colored flag. So that was the symbols of 3 different periods of Russian history, and that was a representation of the idea of the uninterrupted sequence of Russian history. So Soviet, that was in the beginning of so-called normalization of the Soviet time of history, because in the previous decade, during Yeltsin, the Soviet history was mostly, not demonized, I would say, but the Soviet history was portrayed as a period of cruelty, only cruelty. I would say there was cruelty, of course, but that was a period which would be better delete altogether from the Russian memory, which was, of course, could be unachievable. And that is Putin tried to re-establish the Soviet history in the long history of the Russian people and the Russian state. So that was the first idea. And the first problem that the regime faced in that attempt was the problem of the 1917 revolution. That was a big revolution which changed everything, which forced a big part of the Russian people to emigrate. That was followed by the cruel civil war, bloody civil war with millions of dead and with subsequent Soviet repression. So how to deal with 1917? And the first answer was, okay, let's turn 1917, the Russian Revolution, and actually October Revolution, where Bolsheviks came to power, into the memory or commemoration of the national unity. And that was actually the first attempt to rename the day of the October Revolution, November 7th, into the day of the unity, national unity. But after 2003, 2004, after the so-called Orange Revolution in Ukraine, when the people on the streets actually ousted that time, Yanukovych, who forged the elections according to the popular opinion, the fear of the popular revolution infiltrated the Moscow, the Kremlin political thinking. And it immediately influenced the way the Kremlin looked at the Russian history. The revolution became the swear word, and since that time, the revolutionary movements became the turned to be very unwelcome into the Russian textbooks and the Russian political speeches. And the Russian Revolution of 1917 became, even the day of the October Revolution was not just renamed. At this time, it was abolished as a holiday, and the holiday was moved to another day, to November 4th instead of November 7th. And that was a beginning of the counter-revolutionary view on the Russian history, and that actually produced an interesting effect quite later in 2017, during the centennial anniversary of the Russian Revolution, when the state actually kept silence about the revolution because the regime probably was very counter-revolutionary. But two big conservative portions of the Russian population were at odds in relations to the Russian Revolution, because one of these conservative forces which supported the regime were Russian Orthodox Church. And Russian Orthodox Church had a very definite idea about the October Revolution and the Revolution of 1917 as a huge crime, which actually resulted in the assassination and martyring of last Russian Tsar Nicholas II and his family, and the Russian Orthodox Church made Nicholas II the Russian saint. So that was a huge crime against the natural way of things. So for the Russian Orthodox Church, the revolution was definitely a very early page of the Russian history. But there was also another conservative part, which by 2017 became one of the pillars that the regime stand on, and that was a Communist Party. And the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, with its big electorate, celebrated October Revolution, because for them, for the communists, October Revolution was still the beginning of the new era, of the new opportunities, and the breakthrough to the better future. And for them, the revolution continued to be the bright page of the Russian history. So regime just wanted to keep silence in 2017 because it did not want to counterpose two major conservative groups of its own supporting groups against each other, and that is a problem that the regime faces when try to deal with the revolution. After that, the regime and Putin, if we can personalize this group of people who created this historical politics in Russia, historical dimension of the Russian politics, they tried to, they actually tried to use different periods of Russian history. During the first decade of his presidency, Putin spoke favorably and at length about Pyotr Stolypin, pre-revolutionary prime minister, reformer, and at the same time the person who suppressed the first Russian revolution of 1905-1907. He also mentioned another Russian reformer, pre-revolutionary reformer, Count Witte. So that was an attempt to deal with the pre-revolutionary reformist as an example. Later, he also mentioned the, Prince Vladimir, medieval Prince Vladimir, and at the same time, the Tsar Alexander I, who was a Russian Tsar during the Napoleonic Wars. So that was a big, and of course, the baptize of Russia became the important part of Putin's speeches, especially during Crimea and after the Crimea annexation, because Kherson and Crimea was a medieval city where according to legend and myth, the first Russian, well, old Russian, medieval Russian prince Vladimir was baptized. So that was an important part of historical discourse of the regime. But gradually, it started from the very beginning, but gradually the theme of the Second World War, the theme of the Great Patriotic War, took more and more space within this historical quasi-ideology that Putin and his regime used. More and more regime relied on the history of the war as something sacred, something that the regime had a duty to defend, and to defend from any encroaches from abroad and from within. And so the memory of the Second World War became this quasi-ideology, not the whole history, but the memory of the Second World War, of the Great Patriotic War, acquired more and more of the sacred feature of the sacred memory, and became more and more important. And we can, well, there was several challenges, of course. There was a challenge from abroad, from the former Soviet republics, which started to reassess the history of the war, from the Central European countries, from Baltic states, from Poland. Each of them were rewriting their understanding of the former socialist Soviet understanding of the Second World War as something different. And, you know, the new idea that the war, the whole Second World War, was a clash of two totalitarian states became popular, especially in Poland, but also in some other states, in Baltic states, and that was unacceptable for Russian regime. But you know, it was probably unacceptable for most of the Russians, because for Russians it was very important to think that Russia was on the Soviet Union was on the right side during the war. That was an important way to think about Soviet participation in the war. And you know, 26 million people died for something, for some important aim, important goal to get Europe rid of Nazism. So the idea of totalitarianism was extremely unpopular in Russia, but the regime even reinforced this challenge from the part of the Poland, because the regime wanted to portray itself as a defender of the sacred memory of the Soviet people, of the Russian people, and that eventually became very comfortable position comfortable position of the defender of the sacred memory. But there was also the challenge from within, the challenge from people in Russia. Well, among them were historians of the Second World War, studied some of the topics, some of the themes which would be inconvenient for the regime to defend, because the memory of the war certainly was not only the memory of the victories or the memory of the fighting against Nazism. It was also the memory of some ugly stories of the of the behavior of some of the Red Army officers in the occupied Eastern Europe. It was also the story of, as any war, it was a story of bloodshed with a lot of cruelty. And it was also the memory of those Russians who changed the fronts. So those Russians who went to German side and fought there, so-called Vlasovites, after the name of General Vlasov, who was a Red Army general, but then he became the leader of the pro-German, pro-Nazi military formation within the German army. And he was executed, hanged after the war by the Soviets. But so Vlasov and Vlasovites were, according to regime, according to official history of the Second World War, were certainly just traitors and villains, and there is no way to study them, to study the motives of many people. It was hundreds of thousands of people actually who found themselves on the German side in different positions. So when a historian, Kirill Alexandrov, several years ago wanted to defend, actually he defended his dissertation on this pro-German formation of Russian people in German army. It became a scandal, and it went up to the Ministry of Education and Science, and the Ministry of Education did not agree to the award of his degree. So Kirill Alexandrov did not become Doctor of Sciences because of his research, which was a good research from the point of view of history. But it was a clear demonstration by the regime that the regime did not want historians to study the Second World War, actually, because the regime used the Second World War as a as a language of politics, as a canon, I would say, which was used as a clear-cut formula to judge other political events. And the language of the Second World War was used by the regime in many critical moments of the international politics, of contemporary international politics. During the fightings on the east of Ukraine, in Donbass in 2014 and 2015, especially in 2014, the Russian propaganda used the language of the Second World War to describe Ukrainian army as punishers, the word which was used during the war, and it was applied to German forces. And they called the Donbass fighters as militia, ополченцы, which is a word which with a very positive connotations against from the 1941, from the time of the Second World War. So this was very important for the regime to keep the language clear, to keep all the labels attached to different events and different personages, different characters of the war with a very clear meanings, and that meanings could be used in the contemporary political arguments. So that became, and that is why the regime actually first introduced the law, actually criminalized so-called rehabilitation of Nazism. This is the language of the criminal code now, but it included a lot of strange thinking to criminalization of Nazism. And then it went further, and last year the constitution of the Russian Federation was amended, as Nina mentioned already. And one of the amendments, we all usually discuss the most important amendment, that Putin got the permission to be elected president again and again. But there is also a new an amendment to the constitution which vested the state, Russian state, with a duty to defend memory or defend Russian history, to defend the and that is something really strange. Again, historians started to to get alerted. We do not know how the state will proceed with this new constitutional amendment, but what we saw already in the fall of 2020, the investigative committee of the Russian Federation started several investigation of the events of the Second World War. They want to investigate the genocide of that the Nazis made towards the Russian state, which is a very unusual politics and unusual behavior from the part of the investigative committee. Before that, investigative committee did not participate actively in the historical politics, but now it is also on the stage. But I should say that this is not the only story. Well, up to now, I told you the story how the regime used the history and why it was relatively successful. It was really successful because actually nothing else was important for Russians in terms of ideology, in terms of their identity thinking. But because of that, because the Russians indeed were concerned about the past, concerned about the memory of the Second World War, and it is indeed an important part of the memory, not just state memory, but the family memory. You know, again, 27 million people died. You know, it means that almost every family in Russia had somebody, grandfather, great-grandfather, died in the war. And every family had grandfathers who fought in the war. So that was a big portion of everybody's memory. And that is why in the second decade of this millennia, the new phenomena emerged, this Immortal Regiment that Nina also mentioned. Immortal Regiment was initially was a social movement, I would say, the popular movement. The people went to the streets on the Victory Day, May 9th in Russia, with the portraits of their relatives who fought in the war, with grandfathers, great-grandfathers and grandmothers, those who fought during the war. The generation of really war veterans almost faded away. And so they brought the pictures of them, pictures of their deceased relatives who fought in the war. And that became very easily and very quickly, it became very popular, nationwide in Russia. It was first suggested by the group of journalists in Tomsk, in Siberia, city of Tomsk, in 2012. You know, 2012 was actually I would agree with what Nina said, that was a turning point in the Russian historical politics. That was a year when the Russian Historical Society was recreated, the Russian Society for Military History was created, when Vladimir Medinsky was appointed Minister of Culture, and Vladimir Medinsky was an important person in the Russian historical politics. And that was also the first year of the first Immortal Regiment. And next year, in 2013, in 2014, the number of cities where the Immortal Regiment went to the streets and the number of participants mushroomed. You know, it grew multiplied in geometrical progression. It became from several hundreds of people in the first procession, it became hundreds of thousands already in 2 years. And before the pandemics in the 2019, it was up to 10 million people participating in the Immortal Regiment. And I want to say that this is an important story, how the people wanted to reclaim the war history from the state. My idea, and I know there are a lot of opponents to me, a lot of people now consider the Immortal Regiment as something like a demonstration of loyalty of the people towards the regime, because the people went to the streets and actually they supported the myth of the Second World War, which is so important for the regime. But from my point of view, it's quite a different story. The story started as an opposition to the state usage of the war memory. It started with the attempt of the people to say that, no, this is our family history. It's not a history that the state can use for its own sake. It's not President Putin who defended the motherland. It was my grandfather who did it. And that is very important. It was very important for the first organizers and the many participants of the Immortal Regiment. That is why. And that put the regime in the very difficult position, because well, unlike other social movements, which actually emerged at the same 2011, 2012 in Russia, it was multiple social movements from grassroots. But the state, with its turn to traditional values after 2012, actually suppressed most of them. But state could not suppress the Immortal Regiment, because the Immortal Regiment used the same language and the same mythology that the state used. How you would punish people? Actually, the state punished the first organizers in Tomsk, the TV company, the journalist from which started the whole movement. The TV company lost its license, and partially because of their participation in this Immortal Regiment creation, but it could not suppress the whole idea. So what state did, state tried to hijack the movement, and it used a lot of administrative resources to hijack the Immortal Regiment. It created the another organization. They call it Immortal Regiment of Russia. And it received a lot of administrative support. And of course, for them, they wanted to turn the focus of the Immortal Regiment to like patriotic, pro-governmental movement. But the problem is that the participants, you know, if there is a 10 million people participating in that, for most of them, I dare to say, for most of them, this attempt by the group of organizers to reshape the ideological meaning of the Immortal Regiment is not, well, is not even familiar. And that is why the first group of organizers, people from Tomsk, still possess a huge say social capital. They're still very important people in the whole movement, and they still support, well, they still have their own website and their own followers among many local organizers of the Immortal Regiment across Russia and in the other countries as well. So that is a kind of, I would not call it balance, but it's like two, I would say two groups that wants to represent the social movement. But the social movement itself is not a like mnemonic actor. It is a social movement. The Immortal Regiment is a social movement. And that is why it is hard to hijack and to start to represent the Immortal Regiment unilaterally, as the state would probably want to do. And this is, well, this is a very last thing I want to say, that what we see by 2021, in this pandemic year 2020, we see that the Russian state heavily uses the history, and especially the history of the Second World War, as a quasi-ideology, and it's tried to restrict the interpretations of the Second World War. But at the same time, there is a really big social movement which is not totally controlled by the state, which is actually represented the family history of the war. And this is very important to understand, that very important to catch, that the state does not control everything while it's want to do it. And this is some of the clash, some type of the clashes within Russian society. I did not mention the other very important story of the memory of the Stalin repressions, and it's probably I will do it during the Q&A sessions, because I see there is a question about that. I'll stop here at this point. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kurilla. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. And I want to alert you that we have a lot of questions from the audience, both from audience who people who are watching from on YouTube, and also by Zoom. I raised a few questions, I think, to both of you, Professor Tumarkin and Professor Kurilla. And then I'll turn to the questions from the audience. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union. Do you expect that the Russian government will mostly ignore this occasion, or will the authorities try to use it as a way of glorifying Putin's 21 years in power? The other question is connected to use of Russian history, and also is touching, I am touching the Stalin era. Professor Kurilla just mentioned this period. You spoke a lot about 1917 revolution and its effect nowadays, and in terms of historical memory. How much do Russian high school students learn about the terror and atrocities of the Stalin era? If you can answer quickly. And I have one more question that covers 80s and 90s, the Cold War era after Stalin, and Mikhail Gorbachev coming in power. When, if ever, do you think Russians will look more favorably on Mikhail Gorbachev? He turned 90 last month, but the event received little attention inside Russia. Will there ever be an opportunity for a more balanced appraisal of Gorbachev's time in power? So these are my initial questions, and then we got a few questions connected with Russian textbooks, use of Russian history in school, etc. So do you want me to wrap them now or no? You can see, Nina, we cannot see you. Your microphone is muted.
Right. No, I think three questions is enough. We don't want to have to try to remember all the others at the moment.
Yeah. And then I'll wrap the rest from the audience. Okay. Well, maybe Professor Tumarkin would like to offer.
Yes, maybe I would leave for Ivan Kurilla the question about what Russian high school students are learning. The 30th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union, do we expect that the Russian government will ignore it? They can't ignore it, but what they can do if they want is instead in 2022, at the beginning, to commemorate the beginning of the Russian Federation. So rather than the end of the old, they would celebrate the birth of the new. That's one way to look at it. You write here, will the authorities use it as a way of glorifying Putin's 21 years in power? It seems that nowadays almost anything would be used to try to glorify Putin's 21 years in power. But it can't be done completely because Putin did not become president right after Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet Union ended. So it will be interesting. It'll be interesting to watch. And Ivan and I are historians. So one of the great things about being an historian is that we're not usually asked to predict the future the way political scientists are. There are many other great things that are better about being historians as well. Ivan, do you have any response here?
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, well, we all remember that Putin called once dissolution of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe, and that's actually how he considered the 1991. And of course, for opposition intelligentsia, at least 1991 was a defeat of the GKChP, you know, this anti-Gorbachev coup attempt. But certainly many people now felt that you know, eventually what Putin did with Russia was actually approximately the same that GKChP wanted to do it immediately. That is probably, it's not just, but it's a kind of common mood. So I would not expect the big celebrations of anything in 1991, but the story of 1991 is less controversial for the regime than 1917, I say. So I could expect some of the speech probably from Putin, or if not from Putin, but from somebody, I don't know, Medinsky, Naryshkin, any other people who from time to time speaks about the past. Even Shoigu, you know, from time to time now speaks, the Russian Minister of Defense. And answering your question about the high school students, there is a chapter of the Stalin repressions in the contemporary high school textbook. So the people, the school children do study the repressions of Stalin. It's obligatory part of the curriculum. But at the same time, the like official position requires to balance the repressions and the bad side with something positive. So they would probably thought that, well, there was repressions, but we won the war, or we before the war, the Soviet Union built a huge industrial potential, or something like that would be thought. But of course, we know that it all depends on the teacher. And it's and it's according to the high school teacher what focus will be on what. There are many teachers who are anti-Stalinist, and they would probably stress the importance of the learning of Stalin repressions. And that Memorial, the big NGO which studies the memory of the Stalin repressions, the Memorial had until recently the special competition for high school students about the memory of the family memories, and many teachers actually participate with their school children in that memorial competition. But recently the law enforcement tried to get teachers out of that competition after Memorial was claimed foreign agent according to foreign agent law. But of course, there are some high school teachers who would probably more pro-Stalinist, and they will teach different things. So there are in textbooks, but how the people are got instructed, it all depends on the local teacher, I think.
I could add that to the question about will Russians look more favorably on Mikhail Gorbachev, again, a prediction question. It's hard to imagine, well, ever, who knows what's going to happen ever, but he is so demonized and so associated with the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century that Ivan just alluded to, that it's kind of hard to imagine him coming back as being viewed in a balanced way, at least for a while. I don't know, what do you think, Ivan?
I would say, when I grew up in the 70s, it was difficult to hear any good word about Nikita Khrushchev. In the 70s, Khrushchev was either the personage of, anecdotes, of jokes, or somebody with irrelevant to politics, some person with. But later, during Perestroika and after the Perestroika, Khrushchev reappeared as a reformer, as a person who was actually helped Soviet Union get rid of the Stalin legacy. So the whole image of Khrushchev improved significantly. Well, since like 20 years after his leadership. So I would, judging from the as parallel judgment, I would say that next time Russia will enter the epoch of reforms, Gorbachev will be seemed much more positive than now. But we don't know when it happens, but it will definitely happen at some point.
Okay, thank you. I think that we have so many questions now. I can do at least two rounds of quick questions and quick answers. And I would, from the audience, these are questions from the audience, and I'll start with Professor Tumarkin, and I think there's at least two questions, Professor Tumarkin, that are going to you as a specialist in historian, a specialist in Russian history. So one question is from Eli Tenenbaum, who is asking, is there any where he can find more information about the research done on these Russian soldiers who fought for the Germans? Or has this information been mostly made inaccessible due to censorship? So this is one question. The other one goes back to the history. It's a question from Dan Rowand, who is asking, what is the new line on early modern history particularly the reign of Ivan IV. How is it spread and enforced? So,
right. Thank you. So I'll start with that other one. Dan, it's very nice to quote here from you. The new line on early modern history. Well, the first part of the new line goes back even farther than Ivan the Terrible, because it has to do with that statue of Saint Vladimir, Prince Vladimir, that went up, and making sure that everybody knows that he is the founder of Rus and not of Ukraine. So that's, I mean, obviously it was both, but that's very important. In terms of the reign of Ivan IV, it's very controversial. I mentioned very briefly that a monument to him went up in Oriol, in the city of Oriol in 2016. And actually, very briefly, one was put up in Moscow, and then it was vandalized within like an hour. I mean, Ivan could correct me, if I'm wrong on that. In terms of generally he's viewed, I think, quite negatively, although the positive aspects of Ivan the Terrible are the ones that Stalin insisted on, which is, he was the founder of the Muscovite, of the strong centralized Muscovite state. He also really was the first to turn the Muscovite state into a multinational empire on a large scale with the conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan. I guess those are the two. In terms of enforced, nothing, no new lines are really enforced. This is not, it's not that kind of country. Just in general, when we think about how people get their information, young people, of course, are taught in schools, and schools that there's just a huge discrepancy from what I can understand from Russian sociologists. There's huge discrepancy between the rather traditional Russian schooling that people get and the much more progressive society that young people live in, especially so many of them living on the internet. So many students are also getting their information from maybe young people from the internet. There's a huge discrepancy between the 18 to 24-year-olds and where they get their information, and the people over 55 who mostly get their information from television. So that's something general. And the question about information done on, well, Russian soldiers, I guess you mean Soviet soldiers who fought together with the Germans or for the Germans. It's absolutely possible to research. I think especially if you go to Kiev, it's even better to do it there. As you can imagine, just from a geographical point of view, this kind of activity was much more common in the Ukrainian and to a certain extent the Belarusian Soviet Socialist republics because of their histories, but particularly in Ukraine. So I think all of these, I don't think any of this information is inaccessible due to censorship. Ivan, am I wrong?
Yeah, I think there are, well, first of all, there are something in German archives, including the archives which were get into American hands in the 1945. So there are a lot of stuff which is available in the Western archives. In Russia, there is major military archive in Podolsk, where the Ministry of Defense keeps most of the documents, especially prepare it for the trials against the traitors. So that is a lot of things. As far as I know, I never studied that by my own, but as far as I know, there is a possibility to work with those documents with some restrictions because of the new restrictions on the personal data law. There is something like that. But as far as I know, and Kirill Alexandrov, whom I mentioned, did work with a lot of such files. But it went to the censorship at the moment when he wanted to defend the dissertation. And even Kirill Alexandrov, whom I mentioned, did publish his research. He published his articles. It was not actually the censorship still on everything which is produced in Russia or published in Russia. But when it goes to the state approval, when it goes to history textbooks, to the official degree awards, to something which state has a final word on, there is where the state or TV broadcasting, because all TV is heavily controlled by the state. This is where the state censorship works. The state censorship mostly works not everywhere in Russia. And this is actually an important part of our conversation, that I would say that Russia is not the Soviet Union. The state censorship does exist, but it does not cover everything. It cannot control everything, the flow of information. The internet, Nina is absolutely right. The internet is still the place where you can find anything which is published. And not only internet, a lot of media outlets are still relatively free, I would say, or totally free if they published abroad and bring to Russia by internet. So that is, but censorship does exist in the textbook, in TV, in the degree awards, everywhere where the state actually had a legal authority to interfere. But state does not have a legal authority everywhere in Russia.
Just if I could add one quick word, which with regard to the Second World War, earlier this year, I think it was in January, Defense Minister Shoigu issued an order putting off limits for the next 4 years, documents that have not yet been declassified pertaining to the war. And ostensibly it's to expedite the declassification of them, but there's no guarantee at the end of those 4 years that they actually will be declassified. And there's also a provision in his directive to extend it beyond 4 years. So it does seem that, especially in leading up to 2025, that there is an effort being made to control interpretations of history with regard to the war. The other quick point I want to mention, because one of the questioners asked about the Vlasovites, and there was a very good volume put out by the Yakovlev Foundation, the International Democracy Foundation, which had to disband a few years ago. But they put out one good volume. And about that, there is research that has taken place, as both Nina and Ivan mentioned. But the area that is really taboo, though, especially under the 2014 law that Ivan and Nina mentioned, is that there is no opportunity to look at everyday collaboration with German forces. So, for example, as the Wehrmacht swept through the western part of the Soviet Union to look at the extent to which there was collaboration. There were efforts made to look at that topic in the 1990s, but it's thoroughly off limits now. And similarly, with regard to the behavior of Soviet troops in countries that they occupied, say in 1939 to 41 in Poland and elsewhere, and then in the closing year of the war, that too, which has been investigated in some depth in the 1990s. Nowadays, it's almost impossible to do thorough research on that without risking being charged with various offenses under that law.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, everyone. We have a few more questions, and I'll go back to Professor Tumarkin because she got two questions. I think they should go to her. One question is connected to the legacy of the Civil War, speaking about from Oleg Sulkin, speaking about the legacy of the Civil War, who are the real heroes in today's Russia, the Reds or the Whites. And one also good question for his historian, just lost the question here. There's so many questions. Just lost it. It was about Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So from Helen Franklin, in the glorification of the Great Patriotic War, is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact deleted from the collective memory? And after that, maybe I'll put together the final group of questions that are connected again with school history and the reception of the collective memory and history today. So Professor Tumarkin, would you like to answer now or?
Certainly, no, but I'll be very quick because I know we don't have too much time. I'll answer Helen Franklin's or address Helen Franklin's question about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is certainly not deleted from collective memory and has been sort of come to the fore, especially in 2020, as first Medinsky already some years ago, and now this in 2020, Vladimir Putin went really overboard to justify it, to absolutely justify it. So it's there. It's just the history has been very much distorted, and at the same time, it goes along with a contention of Putin's that Poland is responsible for the outbreak of World War II. And you know, Ivan, you might want to add something to this.
Medinsky even published an article under the title "The Triumph of the Soviet Diplomacy" about Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty. He went even back to the Stalin time, even beyond the Brezhnev interpretations somewhere. Yeah.
Right. And the other question about the heroes, who are the Reds or the Whites in the Civil War? And of course, not of course, but I think the answer is none of them, none of the above. The Civil War is absolutely, I mean, if Putin and the Kremlin hate the idea of the revolution, they hate the idea of the Civil War even more. Talk about silence, the 1918 beginning of the Civil War was just hardly noted, or certainly nobody has talked about the centennial of the end of the Civil War. It was the time, the worst time, when the country was absolutely sort of divided and conflicted, and millions of people died. And so I suppose the Reds have to, none of them were heroes, but in the Soviet period, of course, the Reds were heroes. But now that's not talked about very much. In a sense, perhaps the Reds were worse because they lost the war and the Soviet Union came to the fore, whereas the Whites represented the empire. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, as Ivan has mentioned, it was certainly not considered all bad. And it was a time when the territory was a state that was enormously respected and feared and powerful. So there's also that aspect. Ivan, you want to add to that, please?
Just about Reds and Whites. There is a project, almost completed but not yet finished project, to build a monument to reconciliation of Reds and Whites in Crimea, in Sevastopol. And they actually wanted to erect it in 2017 for the centennial of the revolution, and it did not work. Then they actually erected it last year, but they continue to postpone the official opening of the monument because it actually suddenly, unexpectedly, probably for organizers, it led to the clash, to the tension between like pro-red and pro-white forces in Russia. It suddenly became clear that Russian society is divided to the Reds and Whites. Well, never before people actually seriously thought about that. But when they erected a monument in Sevastopol, there is a real political clash around it. Neither Reds nor Whites wants the reconciliation. I mean, this monumental reconciliation. We don't, and that's why I think that the regime now wants to take back and not to remember the Civil War altogether, especially looking into American clashes around Civil War history, because, well, this is a kind of parallels that certainly comes to minds about how to deal with a civil war.
Well, I just want to add for people who actually are interested in this question that Marlene Laruelle, who publishes a new book, it looks like every other week, has come out with a wonderful book on the history of the historical memory of the Civil War between the Reds and the Whites. It just came out, I think, this year, so you might want to take a look at it.
Well, thank you very much. And I have, I think that I got a permission to go some maybe other 5 or 10 minutes. So I'll use this opportunity to ask the final question, which will be a combination of the questions that I have here, especially the question that comes from Golfo Alexopoulos. She's asking, her question is about the reception. Concerns reception. Is Putin's manipulation of history resonating with the public, young, old, rural, urban, etc.? Which historical revisions have been more or less accepted by civil society? And here there is another question that comes here, but it's connected with the schools again, and from Chris Markin. Do you have any insight as to how this philosophy of glorification of Russian history through victorious memory is being executed in Russian schools? So these questions are connected with reception today. And I think that we can finish with this. So any of you, Professor Tumarkin?
I think you can start.
I can start.
Starting off every single one.
Well, ladies first, I think. So that's why I'm giving the floor to Professor Tumarkin, and then I'll give you the Professor Tumarkin, please.
I cede to Ivan first.
Okay, yeah, let me start, yeah, because Nina was first all the time, so let me step in. Well, I would say that it does resonate with many Russians, and that is why he uses it, because nothing else resonates as well as history. Because, well, no political purposes, no traditional values has a wide resonance in Russia. You know, that's other attempt to build some new ideology on the traditional values. Well, it does not resonate. The Russian society is not a traditional society. Well, there is, of course, portion of it which is traditional, but not the majority of the population. While history is something that can be manipulated, and that this regime is pretty skillful with this manipulation of history. Sometimes the regime went a bit beyond the possible, beyond the acceptable, as in the case with war memory, when actually, as I mentioned during my presentation, the Immortal Regiment emerged as an attempt to reclaim the war memory from the regime, and that was one of the examples when the regime pushed too far in its usage of the memory to its own, to reinterpretation of history to its own sake. But generally speaking, the history does resonate with the Russian psyche, I would say. But again, you know, this is already the 3rd decade of the same regime rule, and the people got tired. What I can feel, I have no sociological, polls result or sociological research in my hands, but my feeling that the people are getting tired of the overuse of the history as a only important political topic that is discussed in Russia. There is a lot of real politics which are accumulated, real political problems which are accumulated, and the history, well, the people, I guess this is maybe I'm wrong here, but my feeling that it's became less and less acceptable, this overuse of history, less and less acceptable in the society. Maybe it's because of the whole fatigue of the regime, and this is one of the important features of the regime, this overuse of history. But it looks like regime, and probably because the regime actually exhausted most of the important points in the Russian history. It used like almost everything which can be that the Russians can be proud of, and what else can be used out of the Russian past. Everything had already been used, and that's also the problem for the regime, I guess. Thanks.
Well, I think I can add that what I'm waiting for is a reappraisal of the history of the 1990s, which has been portrayed from the get-go by Putin as only the time of chaos, even though he's always been loyal to Yeltsin. He sort of promised to be, and he has been more or less, but mostly that it's viewed as a time of chaos and catastrophe and disaster. And who is talking about the 1990s as a time when Russia was liberated from being the Soviet Union, and when democratic structures were instituted, and there was a market, and there was, things opened up. So it'll be interesting to see in the future, the way you asked Nadia about the reappraising Gorbachev. It'll be interesting to see about how the 1990s might be viewed. Maybe people, how long can Putin keep saying that he saved Russia from the chaos of the time that was 22, 25 years, quarter of a century ago? Ivan,
let me add just a moment. There is such a phenomenon as Yeltsin Center in Yekaterinburg, which actually keeps a different narrative of the 90s, which is a bit strange thing. It's state-supported organization, which is still keeps a quite different story about the 90s, which is actually creates some tensions and creates some, I would say, diversity in the dealing with memory of the 90s in the Russian society.
And Mark,
there's also the in addition to the Yeltsin Center in Ekaterinburg, there's also in Moscow the Gorbachev Foundation building, which it's not a state supported foundation, but it is quite active, and they have a very visible presence on the internet too. Gorbachev as Nadia mentioned, is now 90. But he, is still, and again, it's not physically is not really anything like what he was, but still, he remains a figure who gets interviewed, not just by foreign journalists, but also by journalists from Novaya Gazeta or New Times or elsewhere. So there are these potential alternatives, but they're not going to emerge as anything like widespread until after 2036 or whenever Putin steps down.
Let's go for the earlier, yeah.
Right.
2024. I still
right. As the author of a book on the cult of Lenin, 2024 is also the centennial of Lenin's death. And so I was hoping that in 2024, 2 Vladimirs could be carted out of the Kremlin, leaving only the statue of the saint.
Okay, I think that we can stop here today. Let me say, Professor Tumarkin, Professor Kurilla, it was such a pleasure to host you today. Thank you both of you for your interesting, thoughtful presentations and fascinating discussions. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in the other Navy Center and Cold War Studies events next academic year, when Harvard will reopen again and we hopefully be able to resume the seminars in person. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the Navy Center people, Penny and Danielle, for their help. And thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Mark.